got two key issues which both follow on in some ways from the work that we were doing last meeting, looking at the Kirklees economic strategy. So we're going to be looking at social value and inclusive growth, and we're going to be looking at the skills strategy. I'd like to welcome Andrew Bird, who came along as an observer to last meeting, but now you've been adopted as a full member of the panel. So very grateful for your volunteering to join us as a co-optee. We've also got a couple of other guests this morning. We've got Tom Lloyd Goodwin, who's come over from Cles, and he's going to talk us through some of the work that he's been undertaking as part of item 5 on the agenda. We've also got Rose McManus, who's with us this morning, and Rose is a student from Converley High School who's on a work experience week with the council. So I think you're attending this meeting this morning and coming to the full council meeting here this afternoon. So it's really good to see some young people showing an interest in politics and the work of the council. Right, if the panel members could do a quick introduction, just for the benefit of anybody who may be watching this online. So if we could start with you, Andrew, please.
Andrew Bird, I'm co-optee. I'm interested in progress. Oh, sorry. All right, sorry, I'll learn. My name's Andrew Bird. I'm a co-optee on the Scrutiny panel.
Councillor Richard Murgatroyd from Golka Ward.
Councillor Harpy Upple from Ashbrow Ward.
Mark Mercer, co-optee, just here as a member of the public.
Yes, and I guess I should have introduced myself, Rob Walker, who's the lead member and chair of this panel. We've also got a number of officers who are going to be contributing to the meeting later on, so I'll ask them to introduce themselves before their item. Right, in terms of apologies, we've got a number of apologies this morning from Councillor Bolt, Councillor Armour and Councillor Hughes. Okay, so moving on to item 1 on the agenda, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. I've got a couple of things I just wanted to raise. I wondered if other people have got things that they would like to bring up. Let me know your approval or not. Yeah, so everybody happy to approve them? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any matters arising?
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering, were we going to get another update on the KES, just to see how they were doing with the refresh? Or have I made that up?
Yeah, I think that is something that would be useful, really. Perhaps after Christmas, when there has been more time to undertake work on this. I think we need to arrange a time then, fit it round the other things on the agenda. But it would be good to return to look at how the work is going. Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other thing was just about, I know you were going to be producing a detailed evidence pack. David, I don't know if you know if that's been done, because there was going to be some evidence packs around Brexit, automation, wage levels. We talked about that at the last scrutiny panel meeting.
In short, I don't know. So I don't know anything about anything being done about Brexit at the minute. I'll have to ask some other people. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I must admit, it may be my failing memory, but I don't remember that either. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit here, but it was just that as part of the action plan, one of the things that they were talking about was doing sort of a statistical pack and looking at evidence as part of the KES, and part of it was doing like, you know, the Brexit analysis, wage analysis and that. And I remember at the time I was asking, do you think you'll be able to get it done in the timelines that were set? So just checking how you're doing with that. Yeah.
Yeah, we've just spotted it on the in the minutes. It's,
Sorry, that's my misunderstanding.
Top of page 3. Yeah.
We've held an evidence session with people involved on Monday this week. So as part of that, there was an evidence sort of slide pack produced, which just runs through that. So that's been done. I can share that with you if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be useful to have a look at that. Then we can read through that before it comes back to have a look at things after Christmas. Yes, Councillor McBride.
I think it's true that we don't have any evidence, Kirklees, about the impact of Brexit, but certainly the LEP and a combined authority are assembling information with regard to the impact of Brexit. Yeah.
Okay. Any other matters? Just a couple of things I wanted to mention from page 1, from the third bullet point. We mentioned that there was going to be a meeting of councillors Armour and Hughes with housing officers to look at the age designation and the local letting framework. The first of those meetings has taken place, and there is going to be a further meeting before we get a report back at one of the future committees. So that work is underway. We also mentioned our interest in universal credit. That had come up, I think, as it was linked to some of the discussion around housing and homelessness, which took place in the last municipal year. But this is going to be debated at full council tonight. Well, it's certainly a motion on the agenda. Hopefully it is something that's going to be looked at in full. And again, I do think it's quite an important topic. Okay, is there anything else? Right, okay. So we've covered all those things there. In terms of the meeting, this is a meeting in public. We've decided with the agenda of things that we're looking at today that there is nothing that needs to be taken in a private session. So all of the proceedings will be recorded and will be available for people to watch online. Right, so if we can move on from there to item 4. Sorry, we missed item 2. Interest? Anybody got any interest in this one?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I do need to declare this, but I'm chair of a community organisation called the Kirklees Solidarity Economy Network, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's basically it is all about building community wealth building projects from the ground up, such as community co-ops and stuff. So it's obviously relevant to what Claes is doing, so I don't know whether that's an interest. I just thought I'd better mention it. Okay.
To bring back as part of the discussion, I think, from our next item. Right, so we're going to move on to item 4, which is the update on the work on social value, local wealth building stroke, inclusive growth. So quite a number of things there. The way we're going to do this is that we're going to have a really quick introduction from David Bundy, who's sitting over on my left, and then we're going to bring in Tom Lloyd-Goodwin from Claes to give us an outline of some of the work that's been undertaken. So we're going to start off with David.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, David Bundy, Corporate Policy Officer in the Council, with a lead on this area of work. As you mentioned, Chair, the local wealth building and social value is a key part of the Kirklees economic strategy refresh that you discussed last time. And I know you were asked to hear more detail behind that. So, building on that, it's worth me just taking a couple of minutes to say where this work came from for the benefit of the whole panel, really. Cabinet asked back earlier this year, right at the start of the year, that we take a fresh look at our existing social value policy and procurement practice in the light of social value. Because evidence shows from a cross-party working group about a couple of years ago now that the embedding of social value wasn't what it should be across the council, so a refresh around that was definitely needed. And I think the aspects that we were asked to look at in particular cut across procurement, commissioning, asset transfer, and the way we actually make decisions. Also importantly, to really start from the point of view of understanding our local spend, because to this point we really haven't had a benchmark of our spend locally and how much the usually vernacular leaks out of the district. And that's really where we involved Claire in a commissioned piece of work, who are really embarrassed Tom here, the experts in this sort of work around local wealth building and how social value can be really embedded into not just the council but the partnership as well, and what we call anchor institutions. But Tom will say a lot more about that in the presentation. So it's also worth saying that the work that has been done by Claire has now coming to a kind of conclusion, and a draft report has almost just literally hit my desk in the last couple of days. So we're unable to share the findings here of that, but we can allude to the broad content in that report in the presentation that Tom gives, and I can actually fill in also bits as well towards the end. So is that okay? Without further ado, I'll hand over to Tom Kirklees to outline the work that we've undertaken.
Yes, thanks very much, David. I think that gives some context for this, because this is work that we've been looking at within the council for certainly 2.5, 3 years. So it's good to move things forward. Given the fact that this is being webcast to people, and something that's come up through the Democracy Commission is that sometimes we're not very good at explaining the background to things. If I could ask you, Tom, if you could just give a little bit of background to what CLES is.
Absolutely.
What we do, that would be useful, I think, for any, possibly for panel members, but certainly for people in the wider audience who might be interested in this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so, I'm Tom Lloyd-Goodwin. I'm one of the Associate Directors at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. So we're based in Manchester. We see ourselves as the UK's leading independent member and research organisation that's committed to progressive economics for people in place. We call ourselves a think-do tank, so we think about stuff, but we're very much about getting out there, working with groups on the ground to try and realise progressive change. And our mission really is to build an economy that works for people and works for place. So that's kind of a little bit about us as an organisation. Just a bit more then on the context behind the project, the local wealth building project that we've undertaken here in Kirklees. So David mentioned that this stems from a meeting at Cabinet. That was a meeting back in January. Cabinet members mentioned specifically the work that we'd done with Preston Council around local wealth building there. So in Preston, when we started, spend within the council was very low. It was around 5% of the council's total spend. We then did some work with the council, got them to work with the suppliers, and increased that spend to around 20%. That translated into around 1,600 more jobs for Preston economy. It also helped to raise Preston out of the bottom 20% in terms of the index of deprivation. So some real concrete examples of what can happen when spending within an organisation is refocused within a local area. So with that in mind, it was decided to commission us, CLES, to look at how Kirklees could use the principles of local wealth building to increase social value throughout the borough. Broadly, kind of, why we're doing this, I guess it's increasingly more obvious that our current growth model is failing. When you look at kind of the most up-to-date data, it suggests that we're the only developed economy where, although we're growing, wages are falling. It's an economy where 1 in 8 workers live in poverty, where 1.3 million people, including children, are forced to rely on food banks. In Kirklees, where parts of the district are in the top 10 most deprived areas in the country, we know, obviously, that the council, that the recent Labour manifesto is committed to boosting and improving social and economic opportunity to create an inclusive economy. In order to achieve these aims, it's not straightforwardly obvious how you do that. A radical approach is needed, and it's been decided that obviously a local wealth building approach is a way of furthering this ambition. So just to say a little bit about what we mean when we talk about local wealth building. When we talk about this, we're aiming really to reorganise the control of the local economy so that wealth isn't extracted out. It's not extracted out and given to large corporations with shareholders so that wealth is ending up in shareholders' profits. It's about trying to retain as much wealth, as much spending as we can within the local area in order to boost social and economic opportunity. So local wealth building has a particular focus on anchor institutions. So David mentioned anchor institutions. So these are really organisations like the local authority. They're large, established organisations that are rooted in a particular place. They're not going anywhere. And they're organisations that can have a significant impact on the local economy and on kind of local wealth building through their actions. So there's a number of things in relation to local wealth building that anchor institutions can do. And it's really about focusing resources to enable economies to grow from within. And so there's four main themes here. There's the spend of anchor institutions, so the spend of the local authority and getting wider social and local economic value from procurement and commissioning. There's a focus on employment activity. Is the council offering decent work, decent terms and conditions? Is it paying the living wage? Do people enjoy their work? Is it helping to create well-being? Thirdly, there's a focus on ensuring that land, property and investments are always for the benefit of the local economy. This might be kind of, extending the use of council assets to let community groups use those assets. It might be about business rate relief, all of those things. And then fourthly, it's about developing more local and democratic control within the local economy. So it's about using the council as much as possible to help encourage a more diverse supply chain, a plurality of suppliers. This is about cooperatives, it's about mutuals, it's about community businesses, it's also about local banking initiatives, it's about trying to have local municipal energy if possible. So local wealth building is a whole suite of things really that can be used to build social and economic value. Now, the work in Kirklees, we're not trying to do all of these things all at once. We've decided to kind of focus initially on procurement and looking at the spend within the council. So we've done a number of things here. So we started off by benchmarking and looking at what the council actually spends. So we undertook an analysis of the supply chain. We looked at your top 300 suppliers, I should say, and looked at where that spend is appropriated across the borough and kind of and more widely in kind of the Yorkshire area and further afield as well. We then looked at where the gaps were. So we looked at where the money is leaking out. We started to kind of work with some of the officers here to identify where some of that spend might be influenceable within the local area again. So kind of targeting sectors and thinking, well, there's some money that's currently being leaked out of the local economy. Perhaps there's an opportunity to redirect some of that spend going forward and bring that back into the local economy and use alternative suppliers who are based here. We then looked at the supply chain of your suppliers, so the extent to which those suppliers are spending locally, what kind of employment practices are going on there. Are they paying the living wage, for example? And then fourthly, we looked more broadly at the activity of other anchor institutions within the borough, so the university, the college, housing associations, and we kind of looked more generally at all of those local wealth building principles, again to kind of create a benchmark to see what other anchors are doing within the area around this agenda. So obviously there's a number of detailed recommendations that we've made in our final report. I can't get into the specifics of those today, but I will say kind of something broadly about those. I think in terms of spend, you are in quite a good place. You're in a similar place to where Manchester started 10 years ago. So we worked with Manchester 10 years ago when we did the benchmark there. Around 50% of their spend was in the local economy. We then worked with them, got them to work with their local suppliers, encouraged those local suppliers to bid for more council contracts. Over a 3 to 4 year period, we transformed that spend to around 70% of spend within the local area. That translated to around 6,000 more jobs within the Manchester City economy. So you can see, obviously, that if you increase 20% here, that wouldn't necessarily translate into 6,000 more jobs, but there would be a proportionate increase in jobs in the local area. So you can see the power of actually working with local suppliers over a number of years and getting them to change their actions. Other things to say, so there's obviously a big focus on procurement. We also commented on some of those other local wealth building strategies. These were more aspirational. Obviously, we've not done a thorough analysis of those. The focus was initially on procurement. But we have commented on employment, land and assets, democratic ownership of the economy, and given a steer for the local authority about how you might be able to incorporate some of those strategies into your work going forward. One thing we really emphasise in the report is the importance of leadership. If this is going to work over the next 3 or 4 years, leadership is vital. That's leadership both within the council, directly from the top, from Cabinet, saying to all of your employees, it is about changing behaviours. It is about changing how you approach procurement and commissioning. It's also about leadership externally as well. It's about the council saying, look, we've got our own house in order. We're thinking about local spend, and saying to those other anchor institutions, it's really important that you do the same as well, because through that kind of collective action, we can really bring about transformative change. So leadership is really important, and cajoling those other anchor institutions. In terms of sectors, again, I'll try and be as broad as I can here because this isn't been signed off, but I think there needs to be a real focus on working with sectors like adult social care in terms of commissioning, about linking in with the voluntary and community sector. There's a real appetite amongst the voluntary and community sector to do more in delivering those services, so getting the council to think about how it can encourage that going forward will be very, very important. And then finally, I suppose it's about, in terms of where that spend is increased within the local economy, it's about focusing on those most deprived wards and kind of looking at where there might be opportunities there to redirect some of that spend. So that's a broad overview. I've said as much as I think I can about the report without giving too much away, but I'd be really happy to take any questions now on that. Thank you.
Yes, that was a really useful summary, Tom, and I think the papers that have been prepared for us before the meeting have also given us a good overview of what's intended. So I think that's a good basis from which we can ask our questions. Yes, so who would like to start?
Well, there's loads to talk about, obviously, because, as you say, we're actually looking at the whole economy in the round and not kind of dividing it up into kind of full kind of silos. But I just wanted to focus on rather than focus on the procurement approach, the big strategic approach where you're looking at the big anchor institutions, because you've kind of got that nailed, I think, pretty clearly, and you're using a methodology that's been tried and tested in other areas, so that's great. But obviously, in a way, for this to be real, it actually has to develop at the grassroots and within communities as well, And so, as I said, kind of when I did the interest, but I do have an interest because I'm involved in a group that's doing that, and we're looking at 3 exemplar kind of projects around food and food poverty, but especially you mentioned one about social care, and we're actually developing a model for a social care co-op within the Combe Valley, multi-stakeholder. I won't bore you with it, but it's really forging ahead, and I just wanted to just give a shout out, if I can, to the officers, because the officers have been absolutely fantastic and helpful in developing this project. So I think sometimes it's important to acknowledge what's good as well as what's bad, maybe. Okay, so that's brilliant. But what I wanted to ask, really, because part of the Preston model was that, there's a cooperative development agency was actually created, I believe, in Preston. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that. And also, really, because it does strike me that if we are going to really develop, then what we need to do is to create a vehicle in Kirklees, some kind of mechanism by which we can encourage the growth of co-ops and mutuals on the ground. And we're very lucky, actually, because we do happen to have quite a lot of really, well, even international experts, actually, about the cooperative movement within Kirklees. So we could draw upon them. So I just wonder, you know, if you could say a few words about how important you think that might be, how it could be developed, what kind of remit you could imagine such a body, and what might be the relationship between the council and such a body, really. So that'd be my question.
Right, thank you, Richard. And it's interesting that there was the picture of Kirklees event yesterday morning down at the John Smith Stadium, and in the question sessions, one of the questions that was asked was about the topic that you've mentioned, about what kind of support can be given to mutual and cooperative organisations to develop further. Yeah. So over to you, Tom.
Yeah, I think just to kind of take your first point about the importance of it all, I think in terms of cooperatives and alternative forms of supply, I think it's absolutely vital that these alternative types of suppliers are encouraged and used within the local economy. The risk of not having them is that you end up relying on just one big player. You end up relying on the likes of Virgin Care or kind of, you know, Carillion, who, if they withdraw, then it's disastrous. You know, it leaves the economy in a very unresilient place if you don't do all of this. So I think encouraging more of this kind of these alternative types of supplier is absolutely vital going forward. And it's really encouraging to hear that the council, that you've kind of had a positive experience working with the council, and the council are committed to doing this, because the council does have a role to play here as an enabler of these types of kind of alternative suppliers. So I think it's great that that's going on. In terms of Preston, I think the challenge with all of this, so yeah, you mentioned the Preston model and the co-op that have been set up there. So that was a food co-op that's been set up in the local area. I'd have to double check on the funding for that, but it was an individual who's kind of had a lifelong ambition to do this. So I think she did have funding from the likes of kind of Power to Change or Community Catalyst in order to kind of get this off the ground. And often with these things, some kind of seed funding is really, really important. And I think, again, moving forward, I think in order to encourage more community business, more cooperative type organisations in the area, it might be about the voluntary and community sector working more together actually amongst itself, to think about consortia bids for funding, to think about how they can kind of build some of these larger pieces of infrastructure together. That was mentioned when I talked to third sector leaders in the area as a kind of something that perhaps needs to be done more in Kirklees. The challenge, I suppose, where you really have seen cooperatives work well is in the United States, for example. You might have heard of the Cleveland model in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, those cooperatives were established through very large sums of philanthropic money to get them off the ground. So that perhaps is the challenge here. There's not obviously those large pots of money immediately to hand, but there is organisations like Power to Change who do fund this kind of community business cooperative development. So exploring that going forward might be important. Yeah, does that start to?
Yeah, just on the question of the council actually kind of perhaps sponsoring or initiating a more strategic, development agency, but because there isn't one at the moment in Kirklees, so yeah.
It's a kind of watch this space, because we do comment on that, and we do pick up on that in the report. I think more kind of co-production, more co-commissioning of services is going to be absolutely vital going forward, and we do comment specifically in quite a lot of detail actually in the report on that, and actually provide quite a detailed recommendation on how it's kind of a starter for 10 as to how you might do it, and I think in terms of the mechanism to bring that about, it's going to be about the council sitting down with third sector leaders or representatives from the voluntary and community sector and thinking which of those themes and broad brushstrokes that we outline in the report are things that you need to kind of take forward in Kirklees. But yeah, it is quite detailed what we say about that, so that should be good.
Yeah, so I think that's a key thing that we need to that this should be followed up. Things are obviously starting anyway, so it's just ensuring, I think, that this happens. It'd be interesting to get a report back. I think you've been waiting very patiently. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, Tom, and thank you, David, as well. I'm really excited about this work. I think it's excellent, and you know, you've spoken about progressive economics and particularly about the impact it can have on deprived wards. So I'm a councillor in Ashbrow ward. We've got particular issues around inequality, and obviously if you looked at the IMD indicators, the indices of multiple deprivation indicators in Ashbrow, there's quite a significant difference if we look at employment, income, skills and the rest of it. So I'm very excited. So, you know, it's excellent stuff. Just a couple of things on the procurement, that stuff that you're focusing on. You've mentioned social care, which is a key service area. Obviously, a lot of our work in social care is commissioned out, and some of the I'm new to the council. I got elected in May, but I know some of the issues about making sure that social care staff are paid well comes alongside the budgets that the council have and the amount of money they can commission out to services. So what can we do around that with this model to make sure that, you know, social care staff are paid well and are valued through this programme? And the other thing is, I'd love to see, I think Richard's already spoken about it, but seeing this model from the grassroots up. So in Ashbrow, we've got some good community organisations, we've got local services to you that are doing some brilliant work through the institutions that we've got locally. They don't have the type of funding that they had 10, 15 years ago, and they are struggling sometimes to get the funds that they need, particularly some of the youth organisations. So again, how can we use this model to, what impact does austerity have on a model like this? Basically, we don't have the same amount of funding that we had before.
Can I just, with the social care staff, do you mean staff who are working in external organisations? I take it you don't mean council staff, or do you mean council staff?
No. So like we commission out maybe our home care services and things like that, you know, like a care assistant. So it's such a valuable job, isn't it? But we don't necessarily, they don't always feel valued in terms of the money that they're getting.
I think it's about, it comes down to a responsibility on behalf of the commissioner. So if the council are commissioning this kind of work, to think, and I say this with the caveat that austerity has brought huge challenges on the council, and and we absolutely recognise that in the context of austerity, it's very hard to think about something other than just cost and efficiency. But I think there's got to be a kind of a moment of pause now where commissioners think, you know what, we do need to think again about public values in how we commission, and what's in, and kind of wider social value in terms of what we're doing. So when we are commissioning services, it's not just a focus. It needs to be not just a focus on cost and efficiency. It's about looking at the kinds of organisations that are being commissioned and asked to do this work, and the council needs to ask itself: are these organisations that have good terms and conditions? How are they treating their workers? And that goes back to kind of social value frameworks, procurement and commissioning frameworks, which need to be looked at to ensure that precisely the issue of wages are being addressed when, you know, tenders are being put out and services are being commissioned, and that should be built in, we would say, into social value frameworks to ensure that those terms and conditions are met. So I think there is a need to look at all of that, and that should come across again in some of the recommendations that we make in the report. In terms of the grassroots stuff, I think it's really important. I think funding is less, as you mentioned, but it is out there, and it is out there with groups like Power to Change, as I mentioned. It does also come back to the sector working more closely together. I was in Toxteth in Liverpool a couple of months ago, looking at some community organisations there, and they've had very little help and funding externally, and what's really helped them there is kind of peer-to-peer working and actually supporting each other in order to get projects off the ground. when I talked to third sector leaders, there was a discussion there about actually financially some organisations needing to help each other out a little bit more. You know, if people have reserves in one organisation, could that be used in another organisation? These are difficult conversations to have and difficult issues to address, but it's possibly looking at that as a focus as well. I think, you know, the focus of bringing funding does need to be in deprived wards, like you mentioned, because actually when you do start to get stuff off the ground, that is where you do see change. In Toxteth, there was a community cafe that I was looking at there, and they had, when the project was being built, there were kind of young people in the area were kind of coming along and throwing stones at the building site while it was going up. But actually, once it was up and opened, kind of that kind of antisocial behaviour dropped off completely, and it started to be an asset that the community started to use. So there does have to be a real focus on deprived areas. There has to be a focus maybe on if there is any council land and assets in those areas, are these land and assets that could be transferred into community use somehow in order to get community businesses off the ground. So it is about funding, but it's also about the council looking at its assets, and it's also about groups working together in the local area as well. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think going back a couple of years to when we looked at social value within the policy group within the council, we did look at the issue of asset transfer and the degree to which we should be looking at social value in terms of who's taking on assets and the kind of things that we're looking at. So I hope that is something that we can return to again to have a look at. Yes, Councillor McBride.
Yeah, I wonder if you could just clarify for me and my ignorance your exact relationship with the council. I mean, are you basically a consultancy? Have they called you in for advice? I mean, obviously you're not going to give the council money, but you're talking about local wealth building and developing local control and so forth. All sounds very good. Exactly how are these ideas going to be implemented? Have you got any authority, as it were? Or are you just advising?
So we commissioned Kirklees to undertake this phase of work, particularly on the procurement aspect, and to, as Tom's outlined, really look at our local spend in detail, the procurement processes, and also they've gone a bit wider than that in terms of discussions with our partners or anchor institutions. In terms of what happens next, and the recommendations in the report, the draft report we've now got, that will be presented to our executive on November the 5th, and the ideas and recommendations in there will hopefully be agreed to, or will be discussed and agreed to, and then plans will be put in place to take those ideas forward in terms of some of the practical applications that Tom's alluded to, like how we commission, like how we actually build more community groups. It's interesting that Aspel has been mentioned already, because just to give an example of that, we already have some practical ideas emerging. We had a workshop of partners back in July, which Tom came to in the presentation there. And out there came some very practical ideas, and Aspel was mentioned in that, in terms of Andy Pritchard from the local services to you is very keen on piloting in more depth in that ward. So we've started some early discussions with them. But the overall question is very dependent on our cabinet actually deciding which recommendations it wants to go with and how it wants to shape a work programme moving forward.
Thank you, Chair. You referred earlier to the meeting yesterday, the Picture of Kirklees event, which is a big event at the stadium yesterday, where we brought together all our partners, partly the business sector, but importantly also NHS. We brought together the schools, the colleges, the university, to look at how we, not just Kirklees, we are shaping the totality of the communities of Kirklees. And it was, I think, a very good event in the sense that it made us think, not just in terms of what do we spend and what impact is it have, which is very sensible. I'm entirely applaud what you're doing. But it's also about commissioning, but it's also really reflecting on the way we behave and the actions we take. So, for example, we employ a lot of apprentices, and we've asked ourselves, are we happy about the government scheme? And we aren't, because what really we concluded is the government scheme is exploitative, because it gets young people's employment at a cheap rate to say £3 something an hour. It's ridiculously exploitative. We've changed that. We've given people a decent wage. It's simple things like that, but it's also about the work we've been forced to do by virtue of the fact we don't have so much money, so we have to do things with people and using the abilities and the potential of the community itself. For example, to reinvigorate a library service, to reinvigorate the kind of community activities, tenants and residents groups and such like. And we, councillors, are trying to delegate some money to these groups to empower them, to enable them, not only to use buildings that we are not using so much, but also to enable them to be effective. We're finding, far from just, this being a good alternative to what we did, it's a better alternative, because we're not doing things to people, we're doing things with people. I think that's really important. I just want a little word of caution with regard to we must all spend our money within Kirklees. That can go too far. It can become mercantilism, protectionism. And believe me, one of the biggest impediments to economic development is parochialism of local authorities who are saying, oh, we're going to protect everything within here. We're going to break that down and reflect on the fact, for example, if Leeds is booming or Bradford's booming, that's good for us, and vice versa. Bear in mind, some of my 25,000 people from Kirklees work in Leeds every day. About 18,000 going to Bradford. And that movement is backwards and forwards. So we can't be too, excessive in ensuring all the money is spent within Kirklees. And I think I'm referring to that alternative tendency, which is dangerous. And I just don't want us to go too far in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that it is important to try and keep wealth and spending locally where it's appropriate. But we've also got to look at where, in some cases, it's better to look outside Kirklees. And I just wanted to ask about how things are progressing in terms of looking at this at a West Yorkshire level, because obviously our council leader, Councillor Pandor, is chairing the inclusive growth within the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. So to what extent do you see the work that we're undertaking here, linking into the strategy of the wider authority?
Yeah, I mean, the initial benchmarking that we've done will give a figure for what's being spent in Kirklees, and it also looks at kind of West Yorkshire as a wider footprint as well, and also Yorkshire and Humber. So it captures kind of that level of spend. So I think that's right. I think it comes back to your point. All of this is more nuanced than simply saying we just need to spend more here in Kirklees. That's part of it, but it is more nuanced and a kind of a more thorough analysis of actually. And this is the kind of influenceable spend stuff going forward. So, okay, we've got a benchmark now as to what's being spent locally. The trick now is to think, right, well, what's influenceable? And it might be, and that's got to be a case-to-case basis. You might say, oh, look, there's an opportunity, but actually when you look at it in more detail, it might be that, well, actually that plays into the West Yorkshire economy, and that's very important there. Again, I'm talking in kind of hypotheticals here, and I hope I'm being clear. But yeah, going forward, I think it will have to be looked at in that level of detail. Certainly, that's kind of what should come across in our recommendations again.
Could I bring you in? Because you've obviously got very interesting experience in terms of managing very large businesses and also looking after things which are in the third sector within Kirklees. What's your take on this?
question was really about page 15 of the pack we got, which is the document summary. And Kirklees comes to this, it seems to me, a little late, given that you've got 10 years' experience in Manchester, and Preston's experience is well written up and in the sort of popular press. I think that poster person was the catering service manager in the local authority for the schools. That sort of transformed where they bought the food from. It seemed very, very emotive and practical approach. In here you talk about starting small and particularly neighbourhoods and piloting and then learning. That's a very good model. But are we being a bit too unambitious, given that you've got that track record of doing this elsewhere? It feels like we ought to be trying to push this harder, because this is a very powerful engine for local growth. I agree with Councillor McBride completely. It has to be non-parochial. You have to buy appropriately. You have to go to people who are experts to do things sometimes. But it feels like we're sort of putting our toe in the water a bit much here, rather than getting on with it, given that there's a massive track record in the country. So we almost seem to want to learn it all again. And that worries me a little bit.
Certainly, the recommendations we make are very ambitious, and kind of, they really do start to kind of offer some real practical steps as to how you can change things. They're not. We feel anyway, at least, that what we kind of say in the actual final report is very ambitious, and it should be something that is able to deliver real change in Kirklees. I think there's got to be a discussion at Cabinet in terms of where some of those activities are focused. But yeah, I mean, hopefully, given the work that we've done already in other areas, we could be looking at shorter timescales in terms of actually bringing about change here and actually increasing spend within the borough. That learning is kind of going to be really useful. It's not.
Coming in, you're really suggesting this flyer that says "start small" is a bit of a misleading way of describing it.
Can I clarify? That's it, right. It's a very good point. Right. This flyer is in isolation from the recommendations in the report, really, which are far more ambitious. Yeah? This flyer really reflects the approach we are taking at the moment. Yeah, in terms of partly what came out of that workshop with partners. We'll start to pilot the ideas that emanated from that workshop, which are quite creative and innovative. But I think you're right in what you say, is that the recommendations that Tom's alluded to a number of times will take us a lot further in terms of a more strategic organisational approach to this whole agenda around procurement, asset transfer is in there, supporting the BCS from more, as Tom has mentioned, in a much bigger way than is alluded to here. So I will concede that this slide is slightly misleading in terms of where the next steps are going, I think.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I think we're working on the documents we've got, and the impression we get from them, I would get from them, is sort of coming to the party late and taking a fairly incremental approach. And that's not what you're now saying. I'm very pleased to hear that. Thank you. With the benefit of all that experience, what mistakes don't we need to make? Again, because you've got that track record. Let's share some of those mistakes that other people have made. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, in terms of, I'm not aware of any big, broad mistakes that have been made. I think it's more a case of the fact that we've looked at this in a number of areas. I think the recommendations that we're making in this report will be kind of tighter than what we've done in the past. I think it will enable the borough to get to the place that it wants to be quicker. That's the hope. I don't think there's no big mistakes in terms of what we feel have been made in other areas. I think the key really is going to be on, and this has been mentioned a number of times in the room, is actually bringing all the anchor institutions together and actually doing that as a starting point. So, for example, in Manchester, when we started our work there, the focus was just on the local authority.
that's where the work was focused for the next few years. When we worked in Preston, we started working with all of the anchor institutions in the area, and I think that would be a key to accelerating work here in the borough. Is kind of, okay, we've done the initial spend analysis with the council to kind of get the council's house in order in terms of creating a benchmark, but actually going forward, the real key will be doing kind of working through these different strategies that we've outlined, but across all of the anchors in the borough. And again, within the report, we make the key point that what needs to happen straight away is creating that overarching infrastructure that brings all of the anchors together and gets them to focus on all of those different local wealth building activities. And we are very specific there in terms of what we say, in terms of how you need to meet, who needs to be involved, and what sort of actions that will encompass.
I think, again, sense of balance. We're not starting to do this work. We are refocusing our attention on things we've been doing a lot for over 30 years. In fact, somewhat Clares grew from activities of the West Yorkshire County Council, Greater Manchester and Lancashire County Council 30-odd years ago, with exactly that kind of thinking. It's been refocused, I remember, in John Harmon's time to look at these kind of issues. And I think it's drawing our attention back and looking in more detail about the way in which we can effectively go about this in a balanced way. And I think, again, I go back to what was said yesterday, the picture of Kirklees. It's to widen the scope of our thinking in these terms, to include our partners and to influence our partners to do much the same sort of thing. So we get the NHS, which employs, 12,000 people. We used to employ 17,000 people. It's a lot less than that now. The university's employment, you think of the impact of that overall, and the college, you've got a massive influence. And I think we are beginning to make an impact to get our partners to think we plan these things together, and the kind of policies we have will apply as much to them as to us.
Yeah, it was something I was going to ask about the response from the anchor organisations. To what extent, from the events that have taken place, the consultation that's taken place, do you think they're going to buy into this? Because I completely agree with Peter that I think their partnership in this process is going to be crucial.
Yeah, I'll talk to that, and just generally, just going back to the point about kind of where you're starting from here, just in terms of where you're starting from and kind of, being late to the party. Actually, the other thing to mention on that is, I suppose that what's going on here, I see it is it's quite a moral response actually to, and you're actually you're preempting disaster that could happen if you carry on down this road in terms of, if you let the dominant economic model continue to dominate the wider landscape in terms of how you do economic development. What happened in Preston was actually they were kind of at disaster point. They really, wholeheartedly bought into kind of the liberal economic, the market liberal approach, and they were relying on a new John Lewis, a new multiplex cinema that didn't transpire. And then it's kind of like, well, this is a disaster. We're left with nothing here. And they were kind of, the only thing they had left was to try and utilise this approach. I suppose what's happening here is that you're by no means at disaster point. Actually, when we look at your spend, it's quite encouraging in terms of where you are. There's more that you could do, and I think that's going to be really positive for the borough. I don't think you want to wait until you're at disaster point in order to start doing something. It's great that you've kind of thought, right, okay, now's the time for us to get involved in this debate. In terms of the other anchor institutions, in terms of where they are, so obviously part of the work was going out and talking to those. I interviewed a number of them in the borough. Again, there's some really encouraging stuff that's going on there, and they're all very, very willing. And even some of I spoke to some large private sector firms in the area as well. One in particular who there might be difficulties in some areas like procurement. They're part of global supply chains, but actually, they're doing a lot in terms of employment, in terms of thinking about social value in employment. So there is a real willingness there. It's not necessarily at the front of people's minds at the moment, but I think they all see that they have a role to play as an anchor institution. That's why I think getting everybody together and actually thinking in this way will enable the borough to take the next step in terms of, one, looking at learning that's going on in other institutions. There's some things that the council's brilliant at. There are some things that the college or the university might be brilliant at that you can all look at and think, oh, well, that's actually, we could do a bit of that. And, you know, it's about sharing experiences and using that to drive it forward. So after doing that work, I'm very enthusiastic about what could be achieved by all of those anchor institutions working together. And I think there's a definite willingness there to do that going forward.
Yeah, it's just it was just a point really about value and about, I think, how this approach could reap benefits right across the piece. And Harpreet asked, you know, how does it link in with the question of austerity? And, you know, maybe a good example, you know, I mentioned earlier this kind of project in the Combe Valley to develop a social care co-op. And a big rationale for that is that actually the crisis of social care is a crisis of the staff getting paid a pittance, of the staff being on insecure contracts, and obviously that affects quality. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that if you can develop local co-ops and businesses, maybe not for profit, so it's ploughing the surplus back in, you can develop, you know, innovative kind of horizontal management structures like has been developed in places like Holland, the Bertzorg model, you know, and above all, you can actually mobilise the family and the community in an organised way, because they're all involved in social care in reality anyway, but it's just not done in a joined-up way. Then that's the kind of thing I think you can actually, this approach will save money, actually, and so you can move away, hopefully the council can move away from a kind of time and task contracting culture with commercial organisations and more to a more partnership kind of working, which, you know, could save money. So yeah, I would say, you know, it's vital, and the potential is amazing actually for developing it.
It's not working. Yeah, I'll be quick. My only additional point was just about member engagement. So I've heard about what Claire's are doing and about the inclusive growth stuff, and I think a lot of us are actually really excited about it, which is nice, rather than us just criticising all the time. And I think it'd just be nice to be sort of, if we could be engaged a little bit more. So I heard about the partnership meetings and things like that after they'd sort of happened, and I know you don't want half the room just to be filled with councillors, but just be useful if we could be kept updated in a timely way. And especially with this Ashbrow work, the first I kind of read about it was in here, but I'm dead, you know, I love it. I'm signed up in that sense, so just anything around that would be helpful. Thanks, David.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially if we're going to do things at a neighbourhood level. We need to ensure that our local councillors, local members are involved, because they're the people who know the patch well, really. My final question is that often with things like this, the people who feel perhaps that they're not as involved as they should be are the people in the small micro business sector, and they are very important. There's a lot of them in Kirklees. How do you think we can get them involved in this process?
I think that's got to be a question to economic development in terms of how it engages with those businesses. And I think, you know, if the relationship isn't there, then that needs to be a relationship that's perhaps developed through the local Chamber of Commerce. I mean, yeah, we've not looked specific. I don't want to kind of say stuff about what the authority isn't or isn't doing without knowing the details. But yeah, the obvious starting point would be to kind of, if that's not being done already, is to, and we do make, again, some recommendations about this, and it's about directly engaging with those businesses through workshops or, you know, some kind of structure like that to actually get the information about what those businesses feel that they need from the local authority. Again, because that's often the trick in terms of, you know, we know there's obviously tendering rules and there's all of these directives about how goods and services can be commissioned and bought by organisations like local authorities, and part of getting over that challenge is about the council engaging with those local suppliers. I'm sure it's doing some of this already, but the extent to which that's kind of fully built into a procurement and commissioning policy, I'm not so sure. So that's what needs to be looked at going forward.
Yeah. So Alan, sitting next to you, is probably in a better position to comment on this. Have you
probably myself. So there is a lot of really good work that's taking place with the procurement team in terms of trying to, generate interest in smaller lots and bidding in. So there's a lot of some meet the buyer events, but I think there are gaps in terms of then the support for those small businesses who don't have the capacity to bid and have the right structures in place. So it's identified as a gap. And I think we'll welcome hearing what you're recommending maybe in your report and looking at what the business support mechanisms might be.
Right, thanks very much, Sue. Right, so we'll finish that item on the agenda. So thanks very much, Tom, for coming in to talk to us today. I think we will remain with a sort of watching eye on how this is progressing, and I think it would be good to link this into the overall economic strategy coming back to the meeting after Christmas to find out how things are going after the report's gone to Cabinet and decisions have been made. And thank you, David, as well, for all your work and your introduction of things today. Okay, so we'll move on then to the next item, which is looking at the skills strategy, which obviously is very much linked to the economic strategy. And Sue, who's going to do the presentation on this, is obviously working across some of the other issues as well as part of your work. So over to you, Sue.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to the panel to discuss about this. Councillor McBride wanted to share a few words as in context and introduction. So before I go into the detail, I've prepared a small presentation because the papers were so detailed with content. I thought it might be helpful if I extracted some of the content into slides, but if I can ask Councillor McBride to share a few words.
Yeah. Sue's going to give you a lot more of the detail and certainly update you on the most updated situation. I just want to talk about the overall strategy, what we're trying to achieve. We have thought carefully about where are the big sectors which will employ people in the future. That's the big question. We do know that construction is going to be massive because we are about to build 31,000 houses in Kirklees. That's going to be echoed in Leeds and Bradford as their local plans come on stream within the next 2 years. That's going to be again echoed with Wakefield. They're proposing something like 18,000 houses, and Calderdale 12. That's a hell of a lot of building just by itself. On top of that, we know the Transpennine rail is going to be upgraded. The government's talking in terms of maybe a 3 million, 4 million or 5 billion, pound package. We're not sure which, but we do know whichever of those packages, a big part of the spend is going to be in Kirklees. Something like a billion between Huddersfield and Ravensthorpe. Just let's think about that figure for a moment. £1 billion of investment within a 5-year period is game-changing. We have not seen that kind of investment for a century in this area. So our strategy is to say, given all that opportunity, we must ensure that the skill and employment opportunities accrue to local people. That's crucially important. So in order to do that, we've got to make the colleges, ensure the colleges are providing the relevant courses to meet that demand and on the scale that it will be. Also, we need to talk with industry or those who could more effectively tell us what will be the procurement requirements within that growth. So we'll be talking to big construction companies as well as others, yeah? There'll be a lot of highway development. There's going to be at least 500 million spent in about a 15-year period on highway improvements based on the West Yorkshire Transport Plan and that which is intended for Kirklees alone. So very, very big spend. But of course, construction isn't the only field. Manufacturing is big in Kirklees, still big. In most areas, it's less than 10% of total employment. In Kirklees, it's still something like 15, 17%. We're one of the biggest areas of manufacture in this country. I think we're about the third or fourth biggest. That is significant. Those manufacturing firms, and they vary from the big ones. Andrew used to work for St. Genevieve. Andrew was one of the big ones. David Brown's and Halsett Cummings, big spenders like that, big developers, they've got a demand to upskill their people. Also, I think Andrew will contradict me or otherwise, that a lot of the people that those big firms are employing are aging. The average age is about 50-something. They need to replace those people. So, again, prepare for young apprentices to be able to take their place with skills which will be somewhat different from the ones that they're replacing, and anticipate all that. At the other end of the scale, you've got something like 1,000 manufacturers who are metal bashers, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, they make things, they provide something within the chain. That need is going to be has got to be addressed. But the third most important sector, which is growingly important, we've been referring to it earlier this morning, is the care sector. Whether it's the NHS, whether it's our commissioning, whether it's the activities of Ocala, lots of people work in those areas with a vast range of different skill requirements. We've got to prepare people to be ready for all those things. So they're the big areas of growth. This is what we're saying to partners. Look, we need to get a message out to the kids about the opportunities that there will be, to their parents, who are influential in their choices, to industry, to let them recognise what the opportunities are going to be, and to ensure that the courses are available which are relevant to those needs. So our partners, we're working together with the CITB, with representatives of industry, with Network Rail, and the body, you and I are members of this body, Chair, to pull together how can we best go about this task of ensuring we get the message out, that we are aware of what the demand is, and ensuring the courses are relevant and so on. That's easy said, very difficult to do. It's going to require a hell of a lot of work and very thoughtful work to bring it about. And then there's another area of our activities, which Sue's going to talk about perhaps a bit more, which is how do we help people to get into work, people who are finding difficulty reaccessing employment, people who are temporarily on the dole, want to be somewhere different, people with handicaps who, again, find impediments towards getting employment. We've got a strategy there, which I'm sure Sue's going to explain in more detail. But within that, I think we're addressing what the real needs of the populace will be, not now, but forward into the next 15, 20 years.
Right, thanks, Peter. I think that's very useful to give it context to the detail, which I guess Sue's going to do. Right, Sue.
So thank you, Councillor McBride. So the paper gave a lot of context and background and shared what the Leeds City region, in terms of delivering its strategic economic plan, provided a plan on a page for that as in Appendix 1. I suppose what we wanted to describe is, and get your endorsement of, was the fact that it's great having a regional approach to this, but actually in terms of galvanising local support and articulating our particular needs, having that plan on a page for all the city region isn't quite enough. And I think one of the biggest differences between the regional plan is that mention of health and social care, which is not as explicit and transparent in that plan on a page. So if I move to the slides now, I'll take you now to the local approach. So what I wanted to do was reassure you that there is a lot of sort of analysis and research taking place at the moment that's informing some of our strategies, like the economic strategy refresh. And we are using similar, if not the same, data sets. Back in February, when we were looking at pulling together a skills summit to co-produce our plan, which is in Appendix 2 of the papers you've received, we based that on a post-16 strategic needs assessment. And as I say, the data sets that are used in that strategic needs assessment are similar, if not the same, as what are currently being used for the KES refresh. So there's a lovely alignment there in terms of some of the emerging messages from the KES and what our skills plan is already aiming to deliver against. I pulled out some very brief headline data there, the key data that we've got 25% of residents with no or low skills, and that spatially can be much worse than that in certain areas of the district. Median wages and GVA per hour is low, so it's low skills, low wages, low productivity, and I think you would probably agree, you've had a presentation from Alan previously, that they are some of the key needs that the KES refresh is aiming to address. That translates into us requiring to close a productivity gap, to increase higher level skills and to deliver economically relevant information, advice and guidance, as well as ensuring all that investment in the district is reaching those that need it. And as I say, I've provided the plan on the page which we produced from the summit, which took place in February, and the idea is that you'll probably agree it's a very detailed plan, there's a lot in it, but it's seen as a living document with our partners that actually, that's correct, that one, yeah. It's a living document that we're not aiming to deliver within 12 months, but gives us that strategy of approach for the long term. So moving on to impacts and measurements, I thought you'd want to understand so we've got this fantastic plan on a page which has lots of lovely headline actions and ambitions, and that's all great, but actually what is it actually delivering? And so I wanted to reassure you that it's contributing to our shared outcomes, which were signed up to at Picture of Kirklees with our partners, about sustainable economy, driving aspiration and achievement, and ensuring that we're creating that best start in life. So indirectly, you might be surprised to see best start, but indirectly, because we're supporting parents and families in the district in terms of upskilling and creating conditions for a healthy workplaces, we are impacting on those young people as well. So specifically, if you have seen the corporate plan, the population indicators we will be delivering against are adults qualified to level 4 and above, increasing disposable income per household and productivity per head. And we also have, for the programmes that the staff within the council specifically are delivering, we also have our own corporate performance measures that we have to report against. The detail of those measures are in the report. I don't propose, unless you have specific questions, to mention those specifically. So, what are the priorities, ambitions? I've popped up there a selection of logos from some of our partners, because this is definitely a partnership delivery plan. And at our summit in February, the partners who, some of which are up there, I haven't put business logos, but we have many businesses who were engaged in that summit. The partners there really want to take this and lead the next sort of refresh and assessment, which really pleases me, because this is about them putting themselves behind our priorities and ambitions. So it'll be no surprise that leadership and collaboration is key. We've talked about that already. There's more we can do in terms of strengthening the way as partners we work together, and the way that we work with businesses in terms of having an economic partnership. So that's work to do. We obviously need to consider workforce demand. We need to understand those key sectors that mean the most to us and will have the most impact. So as Councillor McBride talked about, construction is key for us. We have a higher proportion of construction businesses in Kirklees, so they're vitally important to both locally and regionally. Of course, we need to support our manufacturers, and that is about stimulating growth in our advanced manufacturing. It's about changing our approaches with growth and changing markets for some of our textile manufacturers, perhaps. But it's also about strengthening those metal bashers that Councillor McBride referred to also. We also are interested, a point of difference to the city region perhaps in terms of health and social care and supporting that sector, but also we have an underpinning sector that's of interest to us, and that is the creative and digital sector, because if we're strengthening those creative and digital businesses that are coming up with the new technologies of the future that can change both health and social care, construction and advanced manufacturing and engineering, we felt that that was coming out strong, and we need to be supporting that sector. So skills supply, of course, it's about understanding where are we getting our future workforce, but that's not just about young people, it's also, and most importantly, perhaps, about ensuring that we're tackling the people that are already in the workforce, that are going to be there in the next 10 and 20 years. So there is a focus in here around retraining. And then finally, reach and support is where we're picking up that, how can we ensure that all the benefits of the capital and infrastructure investment is reaching those people that need it the most. So on to alignment and delivery. We've got the high-level plan, but what we're currently doing with partners is going and creating a more detailed delivery plan. How are you contributing to the high-level actions? What are you doing? When will that be delivered? What are the numbers? And enabling us to then identify, say, gaps that enable us to influence provision. The target date for to be completed is December, but we're hoping to have an early draft in November to play back with our partners to say what does this mean. And then in terms of the delivery plan, of course, we're trying to take account of all the different pieces of work in terms of KES Refresh, the learning strategy, Kirklees learning strategy, and economic partnership development. So we don't want to stand still, because we can't stand still with skills. We've got to continue pushing people forward. And I suppose, but I just wanted to reassure you that obviously those pieces of work are in our line of sight. So I'm seeking for you to sort of ask me some questions, acknowledge that the plan and strategy is a good idea to have in place, that you can see that we're delivering going forward, and any general feedback and comments, please.
Right, thanks very much, Sue, both for the presentation and the quite detailed documentation that you've given us, which I think gives us a good picture of the work that you've been doing, which I think is impressive. And I think it's really good to see how the work that you are doing fits in with the wider Kirklees economic strategy and will fit in with the inclusive growth agenda as well. I think it's an important part of the work we're doing in this committee to see how those things do mesh together. So,
so it really, well, first of all, I agree. I think we do need a local strategy, so agree on that one. Definitely. I just wanted to ask a question, turning to page 19. At the bottom, it kind of says about the plan being launched. So, first question really, are these the you're referring to partners, so if just clarify whether these are the partners you're referring to. The second bit is, in the last sentence you said, my assessment is that the input from employers, particularly Kirklees employers, was minimal. And I suppose that's basically, speaking as someone who works in education myself, and, that is always the problem, isn't it, is actually connecting, the public sector educational provision to private sector employers. And so I suppose my question really is about how we're going to measure outcomes, really, because, looking at on page 20, the points about 1.4, 1.5 and so on, I suppose really, what could you give a clearer indication of how you're going to kind of get measurable outcomes as they relate to private employers, because you know, looking at these, obviously a lot of these, it's going to be data that's taken from public sources and so on, quite office-based research. But to get, you know, obviously to get that kind of information, it's going to require an actual dialogue with employers. A bit, you know, and as you said on page 19, the input was minimal. So how are you going to bridge that gap is what I'm asking me. Okay, thank you.
Right, cool, yeah. Yes, the assessment about employer engagement in the regional development of their plan was minimal. The businesses stay local and operate local, so that's what was trying to acknowledge there. Yeah, and on the following point on 1.4, those are sort of our desired outcomes. We would be seeking the economic partnership to be working with us, and once that economic partnership is in place, to understand how we could engage with businesses and in terms of understanding their specific contribution. It's very tricky. We have to talk in different languages to different audiences. So I'm thinking in terms of the business, when we're talking to the businesses, we'll be talking in terms of profit, productivity, and output. But then when we're talking to our skills providers, it probably will be more about skills levels, numbers of people engaged, etc. Yeah, the economic partnership it's referred to in these papers. We are on a journey to creating that economic partnership. We want to create something that's sustainable. And we're looking to work with, in terms of looking at the identity of the district and thinking how we can create that sustainable voice for business. We're engaging with learning place, thinking place, apologies, to undertake some work with the businesses and communities in the district. So I would sort of be throwing that back to business, but would definitely be acknowledging a need to talk in business language. But yeah, I acknowledge it'd be very difficult to capture that data from business.
Yeah, I think that's the need to collaborate with business and all businesses is a reoccurring thing that's come up through the last couple of meetings, and I think it is something that's been taken on board. And I think some of the projects that you're involved with are already making strides forward with that. Things like the work with Network Rail is actually with the alliance of all the civil engineering companies who are going to be involved in that project. So to actually start to talk to them directly, I think is very positive, and we need to try and replicate that in the other areas. Yeah. Yeah.
I keep forgetting, sorry. Hi, Sue. Thank you for the presentation. And Alan, apologies, I called you David earlier, so I'm sorry about that. Sorry. I think with strategies, one of the issues sometimes with strategies, and we all deal with this in numerous organisations, don't we, is about the visibility of a strategy, so making sure the right people know it's there and it's available, and also making sure the strategy delivers and there's a direct impact on outcomes. So how are we going to make sure that this strategy will make a difference and that it will have an impact on our outcomes in Kirklees? Obviously, we talked about the economic strategy last month, and the key thing was around low skills and low wages in our borough. You know, so it's a key thing that we need to do some work on. So, you know, I think it is good that we're trying to do something more local, but it's making sure that we have that impact on the outcomes. So just a couple of things in terms of the vision and the outcomes on the, I know this is a headline. It's not, you're going to have further detail, obviously. My only thing is, and I've got this thing about visions that I went on about it last time, basically, but sometimes the language can just seem a bit vague when we're talking about a vision, and you've got 2 bullet points for outcomes, and it's just, I'm sure you're going to have an action plan that will have more targeted information on there, but, you know, is there something maybe that we could do in terms of making the outcomes very clear on a headline document, so it's something tangible that you're saying like, okay, we're going to reduce the skills gap by 10% across the borough or something like that, so that's just a little bit clearer. And sorry, I'll just mention one more thing, Sue. I do babble on sometimes, but you've mentioned as well in terms of you've got those, actually, now I'm thinking about it, you're probably thinking about those indicators that you mentioned where you were talking about disposable income per household, right? So they might be your sort of clearer sort of targets that you're working off and in your outcomes and stuff. I just wondering, with that disposable income per household, I guess that's one way of looking at, because at the moment we've actually got we might have quite good employment across the country, but actually the wages are not great, and there's a big issue around in-work poverty. So do you think that's the best indicator to be looking at in-work poverty, or should we be looking at different indicators? And then one last point just about automation. So how are we taking account of automation, the impact that will have on skills?
So I'll let Alan answer the outcome, the population indicators, because we were all involved in a workshop relating to that, and then I'll take the automation.
So the point about the disposable household income indicator is exactly the point you're making, really, is that if we don't have that as an outcome-based indicator, which isn't just for the skills plan, but it's about everything we do, how do we actually know if we're making a difference to the people who live here? You know, it's like, and that's the point of it being an outcome-based indicator. So we're not measuring the activity we do through the CARES or through the skills plan. What we're trying to see is it making a difference? So, and if that doesn't go up with all the work that we're doing, then we've got a problem. So that's the point of it. And I think the point about it really is that we've used incomes data in the past, and we've got wage data, but it doesn't, one of it tells us about our workforce, and one bit tells us a bit about those residents in work. This indicator tells us about all residents in and out of work. So that's the importance of it. But it is new and it's experimental. Okay, yeah.
Sorry, but if I could just come in there. I think it is important to look at the average picture across Kirklees. But I think building on your point, Harry, one of the things that worries me is that it's the distinction between what's happening at the top end of the income level and what's happening at the lower end, where you've got people with lower skills levels. To what degree do you think we perhaps need a little bit more detail to look at what's happening to the income of people perhaps in the bottom 20-30% of household incomes within Kirklees?
That is part of that analysis. I think that what is in there, we won't just be looking at just a single thing. We will be able to look at the distribution of that as well. And it is an important factor, because it's an important factor in terms of what we're trying to do around inclusivity. And it's no good if that goes up just because we've got a small proportion of people earning ever more. That's of no good to us whatsoever. So it's a simple expression of, are we making a difference? But there will be analysis behind it.
Right, thank you. That is reassuring, yeah.
Speaking as a former representative of an employer in the town, I find bullet points 5 and 6 in 1.5 frankly embarrassing. Just to demonstrate, that's the average. On average, 39% of employers are not training their staff. On average, 74% of employers not providing work experience. And that's really embarrassing, because they are, like in supply chain terms, those employers should be pulling demand for training and education, and pulling that demand by demonstrating that they offer valuable and quality work, both now and into the future. So, because that's where young people get their information from. It's not just from career services telling them stories. It's the experience of the people that they meet and the people that they can experience through opportunities like work experience. Just your partnership slide was very much a sort of a supply partnership side. It was all the people who supply services to training education. It would be really, really nice to see a much more demand-led partnership. I know you're aware of that from the way you're not nodding your head, but I just wondered sort of what sort of progress you're making on being able to get a demand-led partnership. Councillor McBride mentioned some elements of the demand going forward. It'd be really, really helpful to be able to say Network Rail talking to engineering suppliers saying we need these skills, here's our 5-year plan, here's our 10-year plan, what are you going to do to upskill or create the workforce into the future? And that would, I think there's a real challenge here of young people seeing good quality work in these sectors, because they haven't seen that in the past.
Apologise for my chairing, because I didn't let you really respond to Harpreet's question. So if we could respond to the points that Harpreet had raised first, and then go on to the very good points that Andrew raised after that. Sorry about that, Sue.
That's absolutely fine. So I'll go back to automation and then I'll come on to that demand-led sort of system. So automation, because of our low-skilled, low-waged economy, the city region and with some analysis has identified us as a bit of a red spot area. So there is some work that's going to be taking place to look at the impact of that and the impact of automation at a regional level, which myself and officers will be engaged in those discussions. Automation and the changes in the economy in the future will undoubtedly have an impact on manufacturing and engineering. That could present some opportunities, but will also have some challenges for some of our workforce. Is that okay in terms of an answer? And thinking about that demand-led partnership approach, so the only demand provider, the people who could help us engage with the workshop, the logos that were on those slides, were the Federation of Small Businesses and the Mid-Yorkshire Chamber of Commerce. What we're doing with those two partners and then the University of Huddersfield and Kirklees College is, because we're going out and facing and meeting with a lot of businesses, we're working together strategically with our employer-facing officers to get better at joining up the activity that we work with, capturing the intelligence that we gather when we're meeting with those businesses and trying to work smarter together in terms of how we're joining up our offers of support. So that's working well, but it's an emerging partnership that we're building upon. Councillor Walker has already mentioned about the Rail and Road Partnership, which is led by the West Leeds Alliance, which is a consortium of the suppliers, the private sector suppliers, and it's working exceptionally well. So we've got, it's obviously a really good working model. We've got both political leadership with Councillor McBride and Councillor Walker and private sector engagement, and having the private sector and political leads in the room together has really encouraged our partners, the university, colleges, construction industry training board, etc., to come together. And what I'm trying to do with that approach is pick it up and then replicate that within health, within construction and creative and digital, because it's really working extremely well. It is hard to get employers engaged, and the final thing I wanted to mention was perhaps some of the thoughts around economic partnership and getting businesses more involved. We have tried to have economy and skills boards. We've had a couple of iterations of that, and generally traction falls after a year or so, and so we're considering now, as I mentioned, the Think in Place piece of work, what could a sustainable model look like? And it's feeling like we might have a cluster of some of the larger representatives from private sector businesses, but then we reach a wider set of businesses through thematic discussions that the business leaders can really buy into. So it might be, right, we really need to understand about engineering workforce skills. So actually those engineers, are actually willing and bought into that discussion, so they'll come to a thematic workshop. But we don't have the results of, you know, that quite yet, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I want to follow through what Andrew was saying. He's concerned, first of all, about the fact that it's shameful, the attitude of industry. I did research 30-odd years ago, together with ICI and together with Holsets, as it was then, using them as models and exemplars and champions of good training, and they were. And the idea then was to show 30 other smaller companies. These companies are not in trading because they think it's good for their health or it's good for, you know, to feel good about it. They're doing it because they need to, and the point they were making was they're preparing, they were aware of the fact that their biggest asset was their staff, and keeping their staff up to date and in the know was absolutely crucial. Trying to get that message to the rest of industry has been difficult all the time. I remember when I first came to university, I was here to teach the importance of further education and training, and trying to get that message over them was difficult. That's 50 years ago. 30 years ago, the message was still difficult to get across. It still is difficult to get across. So coming to the wider issue that Andrew raises, which is, to what extent can we have a demand-led approach? Limitedly is the answer, because we don't control the variables. We control some of the variables. We can directly influence what happens re-network rail, because we will be working very closely with them. We can affect some of the construction companies insofar as they're using our land, etc., and we will. So there we'll be able to have a genuine measure of our impact. In the rest, we are talking about a hugely complex organic economy which we are trying to move and shift, and as Alan's talking about, the only way we can measure whether we're having impact there is by indicators, and the indicators will be of additional wealth or people into employment, the quality overall of that employment. It is interesting looking at figures, you know, those really awful figures in terms of incomes, and they're very low in Kirklees. The better incomes tend to be in North Kirklees. Why is that? Because people in North Kirklees are tending to work in Leeds, and the incomes in Leeds are higher because they pay more in Leeds than they do in Kirklees. No, it's those. We've got a low wage economy in the both the manufacturing sector and in terms of the service sector. We're trying to lift that, but it will take a lot of time. Local authorities by themselves do not determine these things. They are just influences on. And I think in the past we've kidded ourselves to think we could really shape the whole economy. No, we can't. We can influence it. And therefore our ambitions should reflect that in what we say. We're trying to do the following things we will have some measure of, rather than we will know.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on the discussion about metrics in a way, and but particularly what Peter's just said, because to quote, he said it's a hugely complex, organic, kind of emerging economy, and I think that sums it up really well. So, how to do it? And I was just struck when you were saying, you know, obviously if you look at these metrics, these are applying to kind of populations as total populations. And, you know, in previous meetings of this body, you know, when we looked at the economic strategy, there was a big emphasis on place, big emphasis on specifics. And I just wondered whether you've considered maybe that actually could be a potential kind of lever where you could help engagement with business, because like as a teacher, well, I mean Rob will know this, I don't know if there's any other teachers in the room, but one thing you often do when you're dealing with quite complex, you know, is they call it chunking. So what you could actually potentially, if you took a place-based approach, you could actually chunk bits of Kirklees and, you know, target particular areas and assess and that's perhaps how you could engage with employers in a place-based approach. Obviously, as Peter was saying, you know, it's not, you're not going to be doing the whole thing at once, but eventually you might get there. I don't know. Anyway, so that was one. It's a suggestion, and I just wanted to ask some questions from reading the documentation. Okay, yeah. First of all, on page 29, there's mention of on the third column where it says workforce demand, it says develop a labour charter to maximise the impact of apprenticeship, levy skills, etc. Yeah, so, I mean, basically, it's not mentioned in the main body of the report. I assume it's going on. I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the Labour Charter. And also, you know, obviously it's crucial we engage with employers, but I think it's equally crucial we engage with trade unions, myself. And, you know, if there's scope for doing that as well, that would be good, and maybe even, you know, there's obviously the regional TUC as well as other. So that would be, and that ties in with what Peter was saying about terms and conditions of apprenticeships and so on and so forth. And the other question I wanted to ask you was on page 31, going back to the apprenticeships. It says a paper is being drafted by Carl Battersby on apprenticeships. I just wondered what's happened with that, really. So that was it.
To add a little to your first point about looking at what's happening at sort of neighbourhood level, which came up in the class presentation, I wonder if there might be an opportunity to do some quite detailed micro-analysis of a ward, somewhere like Ashbrow, or perhaps even a part of Ashbrow, to have a look at the businesses there from the point of view of getting them involved in a more inclusive economy, but also looking at kind of skills issues where you might have small metal bashers and things like that, to talk to them about how they might upskill the workforce, how that might help with productivity and profitability potentially in the long run. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So now you gave me another question to answer as well. So, right, okay. So let me go. So you mentioned about the Labour Charter. So this was something that came out around the roundtable discussions at the summit that we held in February. What we're doing, we're getting there's a set of generic asks that we, as workers, when we're going out to business, we come across. Take on an unemployed person, have an apprentice, pay the living wage, these sort of asks of business. And currently we're embarking upon a programme of work internally with officers around being open for business. The reason for doing that is because we know we're going to try and make asks of business that would eventually become a charter. And I've only mentioned a couple there, but there's many more. It might be, I don't know, be a more greener business, for example. We're wanting to get our approach and our service and approach to business right and be open for them, so that if we then are going, and by the way, sign up to our Labour Charter, they can see that we are trying to support them as much as we're making an ask of an ask back to them. That's why it links quite nicely to the CLES work and understanding the supply chains. So it sort of links into your question in that we're also looking at a way in which we can build on the CLES work, looking at our anchor private sector businesses. We only have 55 large businesses in Kirklees. These are the businesses that employ 250 staff or more. And when I saw that data, I thought, my goodness, actually that's not an unsurmountable piece of work, that taking a similar approach to what we've been doing with our public sector and anchor institutions to work with them. And I suppose what we'd probably be doing, if I can preempt what the delivery plan will detail, is we'd probably be testing out the Labour Charter, the key asks, with perhaps those private sector anchors, Syngenta, Cummins, PPG Paints, businesses of that size that are in the district. So that's the Labour Charter. Thank you for mentioning the trade unions. It won't have come out in these papers. It's really difficult, isn't it, to capture everything that's happening. But there is a pilot taking place in the Leeds City region called the Careers Learning Pilot and a Careers Hub. And through the Leeds City region, we're engaging with the TUC Union Learn and Union Learning reps. So, but thank you for that, because it is vitally important. Many of our workforces are non-unionised in the district, but there are also many that are unionised, and we need to understand and make best use of those routes. So thank you for mentioning that. Apprenticeships paper, yes, a paper's in draft, and Carl will be taking that with myself to executive team. It's a little delayed because there was a similar ask of our internal HR team around what are they doing with the apprenticeship levy and making best use of that for our workforce. And it made a little bit of sense to try and present those papers at the same time. And I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's in the next 4 weeks that we're joining together on that. But the paper's in draft. Yeah, so that'll be in production. And then place-based working. Really excited about the place-based tool, which is just being shared across the council. It's been mentioned at our council managers group, and it was mentioned at the Picture of Kirklees conference. I'm not sure whether colleagues are aware of it, but it's only just been talked about. The place-based tool allows you to have an engagement, a conversation with citizens, including businesses as citizens, and that's what excites me the most. It is meant to be about having a conversation, and I can see, and I'm excited to understand how I can learn from the pilot that's taken place in Golka, to understand what happened with the conversations with business, what does that mean for us, and how does that inform our work. It would be a massive task to roll that out across all wards, but I'm very excited by building on the pilot and seeing what that brings. I think I might have answered everything.
You've obviously experienced working small businesses. As someone with small business experience, how do you feel about this strategy? How would you see that from a smaller business perspective?
Well, it's 10 years since I was in business. I built up from nothing to quite a substantial little business, manufacturing, until the Chinese wiped us out a few years ago. I had absolutely nothing to do with the council or any business strategy that I can think of. I think if you'd approached me at that time, my focus was to make something that I could sell and sell it. Now, I had a few apprentices. I had a lot of lads who would go for a session at least 1 day a week and so forth, but not one of them stuck with the company. They usually left about halfway through, and so far as I was concerned, it was a total waste of time, because you spend a lot of time with apprentices. You've got to give somebody the job of looking after them, and they can't do the proper job while they're looking after an apprentice. Well, up to a point they can. It depends on the kind of job that they're doing. It was useful to us that we had a university handy, and we got several graduates coming in to do important development work. But the only thing the council ever did for me was to take the rates and give me a grant when we got flooded out. But otherwise, we didn't impinge on one another at all. And I really don't understand the business of this strategy. I mean, it's a great idea and so forth, but how it would have actually affected me, or whether I'd have been interested in it, I don't think I'd have even wanted to talk to you when I was in that situation. I don't know whether that helps you or not. I think it probably doesn't.
Yeah, and I suppose that always is one of the massive challenges, as you've already alluded to, dealing with the smaller businesses. And I don't know if you want to say any more on that.
I'm not really sure.
Yes, I was going to thank you, Mark, for that observation, because I think you were talking about testing your business, your labour charter with larger businesses, and I think that will be a very easy process, because most of them will exceed the requirements of your labour charter by the nature of being big enough to be international businesses. So PPG and Syngenta will exceed your minimum requirements. That isn't actually the challenge at all. The challenge is to engage with their suppliers locally and businesses that Mark described that don't actually understand what might be possible in terms of added value. Now that's the real issue for you, not what Syngenta or PPG or Holset think about it. And I think that's really quite a conundrum. So I don't think necessarily the Chambers of Commerce or other collective groups really solve that problem for you, because they're not engaging sufficiently with individual businesses.
You're quite right. I mean, I agree. I suppose the influencing the spend of those larger businesses, business anchors, and then thinking about within the charter, the one thing I didn't mention was about local supply chain and how we'd be also wanting to understand how we can influence their spend and transferring, but also supporting those businesses within the supply chain in terms of, taking on apprentices, etc. It could be joint recruitment, things of that nature. Yeah, you have captured it very, very well, because 99.7% of the businesses are micro, and I believe that your business, Mark's business, was employed 50. Actually, the majority of our businesses are actually 10 or less. So it is very tricky, and that's probably why those percentage figures that we talked about earlier, about those massive figures about not training staff and not having a training plan, etc., not providing work experience, that's also why they're huge statistics, because the micro businesses don't have the capacity. Why would businesses engage in this plan? Basically because they are suffering from low productivity and struggling to recruit is probably the honest answer. Or maybe if we're able to articulate the business benefits and we capture them on that efficiency and cost saving side of things is my answer. But it is a challenging area.
Yeah, I think it is a massive challenge, massive national challenge. It's not just in Kirklees, but it will be interesting to see if we can perhaps make some steps forward trying to address that. Right, okay. Are there any other questions? I think one final one from Henry.
Relapse. Sorry if I missed this already. Can I ask who's inputted into the strategy? So what engagement consultation you've done on it?
So we used the joint strategic needs assessment, the post-16 strategic needs assessment. That incorporates feedback from an employer survey and uses skills data and some qualitative feedback, economic data. So that was the starting point. That went to the summit, and at the summit we had all our sort of public sector learning provider partners, and then the Chamber, the Federation of Small Businesses, and then we had a range of businesses attending. There were the great and the good, the Syngentas of this world, the Cummins, but also we had a lot of health and social care providers attending. If it is useful, I can share the list of people who engaged at the summit. And then what's happening now is, because it was such a huge piece of work, and to pinch Councillor Murgatroyd's phrase, chunk, we had to chunk down all the information from the Skills Summit, but yet you don't want to distill it that much that people don't recognise what they input into. We're playing that back to folk, including sort of the employer rep bodies. I've got to admit, it's not. I haven't gone back down to the private sector businesses.
So thanks very much, Sue. It's been really interesting, I think. Thanks for all the work you put into the material you provided for us to look at before the meeting, and really clear presentation and responses to our questions. Yeah. So thanks very much. And thanks Alan as well for coming along again to help keep things linked up. I think that is really important. Thank you. Okay, so if we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is looking at our up-and-coming work programme, which I think we're sticking to the main things that we're saying we're going to look at, but some minor shifts around. The big thing really that's come along since we last met is trying to move forward with looking at the issue of examining what measures we're taking to deal with fire safety issues in public and social housing. There is a green paper which is currently being put out to local authorities and others for consultation. The responses have to go back to government for the 7th of November. Officers are working on this along with other bodies like the fire service, and it was felt that it would be good for us to look at the material that's going to be prepared in terms of our response so that we can comment on that before it goes back to the government. We did try to fix something up for the 24th, but for various reasons it looks like the 31st is going to be more workable. And I do realise there are problems with this because it's very short notice. People have already got other commitments. But we are going to try and fit this in at 1 o'clock on the 31st. And we are going to get both officers and representatives of the fire service, hopefully as well, to come along to talk to us about what's been happening there. With the other meetings, at the next meeting on the 7th, we are looking at towns and communities, so which should be really interesting, looking at what's happening in Dewsbury and in Huddersfield. For the December meeting, we're going to look at the Green Space Strategy, which is it's quite a massive document actually, so we're going to have to focus in really on the key aspects of that. And we're also going to look at the digital strategy, because what's happening in terms of digital investment is going to underpin, I think, what happens in terms of a lot of the economic development that we're talking about. After Christmas, as we've discussed before, we've got waste minimisation. We'll be doing quite a bit of work before Christmas trying to refine exactly what it is that we're going to be looking at there. We're also going to be looking at air quality. I think interestingly there's some ward level discussion taking place there where air quality plans have been put in place. I was quite surprised actually that my ward, being a fairly rural ward, is one of the ones that's included there because we've got the M62 running across the top of the ward, but obviously that is going to affect some of the more urban wards. I think the other thing after Christmas is that it would be good to get things coming back from the economic strategy, from the work of the inclusive growth strategy and what the work that's happening with skills, just to look at what's happening. The other thing that came up in the last council meeting when we were looking at housing strategy was the opinion was expressed that it would be useful to look at how the housing strategy is working out. What do you think about that returning to this panel for us to have a look at things? Is that something that would be useful, do you think? Yeah. Yes, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, God, there's too much to do, isn't there? But really, yeah, I mean, I agree it would be really useful. And, yeah, so but the other thing, I mean, me and Harpreet were muttering to each other during the meeting, but, I mean, it might be interesting as well, you know, because social care as a distinct sector, you know, of the economy, and obviously how it was linked to neighbourhoods has kept coming up actually in all the meetings. And the problem is, you know, it would be interesting to actually have a discussion of it as a, you know, not as in terms of the actual economic and community kind of impact, but where we could fit that in. I really, I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, the issue with that as well, I agree, it is, economically it's a very important sector, but obviously it's a massively important in terms of the care for our residents of Kirklees. I will raise that. I'll raise that at the Overview and Scrutiny Management Committee meeting, because it would cut across the Health and Social Care Scrutiny panel as well. But it may be something that we look at, because it is a big topic. So yeah, thanks for raising that, and it's something I will endeavour to have a look at. Yeah. Okay. Any? Yes, Albert.
I'm in a memory lapse every time I do that. Just for the next meeting, we're doing towns and communities. Just thought it might be useful if we could get some business representatives, or town small businesses, some sort of representative here to get their perspective, rather than just hearing from the local authority side. So I don't know if it's possible to do that through, I don't know, like a representative body or through Chamber of Commerce or whatever, just so we can get a bit more of an independent view as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Again, it's something that we can follow up, because I think, yeah, it is that wider community, isn't it, that's involved in the town centre. We also spoke about possibly getting out and having a look at some things, which I'm quite keen to do. I thought particularly for Dewsbury, which we may not be particularly familiar with, because I don't think we have a member of the panel who's from Dewsbury. It might be quite interesting to look at some of the things that are happening. The only problem will be fixing something up where people are available, because obviously people have got other commitments. But we can have a look at that, can't we? Yeah.
Yeah, just in terms of the next session, I mean, it would be, I think, to avoid it, being too broad, and so we get, it might be good to actually kind of really dig deep, into certain issues. I mean, I'm very interested in terms of, issues around making the town centres more interesting, market development, how it all links together, so that, again, so it might be worth thinking about, well, who could we get to come along? I really agree with Harpreet. I mean, it's important we get an officer voice, but it would be interesting to hear as wide a voice as possible, But yeah, I don't know. I'm just raising it really as a question. I don't know if anyone's got any ideas, but.
Yeah, we have had an initial meeting with the officers who are concerned with this to sort of discuss what we'll look at, and it included the kind of things that you've mentioned. I think we'll need to get back to them quickly in terms of timing to try and look at who might be the best people to bring in to give another voice, and perhaps other people we can involve in discussions around this. Yeah, so that's noted, and we've sort of been trying to move that on, but we'll have to try and do something certainly over the next week to try and sort that out. Yeah. Okay. Right. So I think the last thing on the agenda is looking at dates of next meetings, which I suppose we've already covered. So the next meeting is going to be, this is the extra meeting, which is going to be on the 31st of October at 1 o'clock. Apologies, people who are going to be unable to make that. And then the following meeting, which was the originally scheduled one, is going to be the one on the 7th of November. Can you remember the time? 10 o'clock, yeah. And as we said earlier, we will start at 10 o'clock, so we won't have a 9:30 meeting. Obviously, we need to be here for a prompt start because we've got to webcast it. So apologies if you were hanging around for a little bit this morning. And thanks again, everybody, for your contributions today. I hope you found it an interesting discussion.
I should be very interested in that next meeting, because I'm the chair of the Kirklees Theatre Trust, and on the board of the media centre. So because the Huddersfield Town Centre, I'm very interested in getting involved. I don't know if that is necessarily assumed to do.
No, not at all. I think the fact that you've got those positions is really important. It's a great benefit, actually, to the discussions that we will have. So I don't see a problem with that. Yeah. Okay, thanks, everybody.